This is the Social Factor.
Welcome to the Social Factor.
Hello, everyone.
Josh and David. Then we have our special guest today. We have my fiance Stephanie.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
they can. They can
Oh,
hear
wow.
you.
Okay.
Yes, they can hear you.
Oh, okay.
She's a first timer.
Yeah, I haven't done this ever.
That's cool.
We have her as a guest because this week's topic is forensic science and serial killers. What kind of ties into they kind of both tie into each other. So
they accommodate each other.
Yeah. So tell us a little about forensic science.
Okay. Well, forensic science is just gathering the evidence from the crime scenes and processing it. Basic real-life detective work.
What kind of like equipment do you use? What do you normally get into? What are you looking for?
Everything. Any objects, anything that looks out of place. You scan the entire room. Look for fingerprints if you think there's going to be some. It all depends on kind of the information you were given going out for the call. So if you were given, say, a call and you're going looking for drugs, that's what you look for primarily. You would look for other stuff, of course, cover your bases.
Okay.
But that would be kind of your main thing.
So it's very target-oriented.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
Okay.
But you do end up finding other interesting things along the way. You don't just keep your blinders on, but you have a guideline, sort of.
So with forensic science, you don't do you go to you collect the stuff at the crime scene?
Yes.
And then do you also go to the lab and then analyze that yourself? Do you go to the crime scene and back to the lab and analyze it yourself?
Those are two different positions in the field.
Oh.
Okay.
One will be, like the one at the crime scene will be the crime scene technician, and then there's the lab technician that'll do the processing at the crime lab.
Okay.
They try to keep stuff separate because we want to keep like biases and everything out of the evidence.
So it's not like CSI.
No.
So what you're saying is because there are chances that the individual in the field might make a mistake, or perhaps has a bias, as you say,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, and so you guys are more neutral, a
Yeah.
neutral party at this point. Okay.
That's what we try to be.
At what point? I assume forensics also deals with DNA.
Yes.
Okay. Are there different kinds of DNA, or is it all the same?
It's all basically the same, but there's different fragments and everything, usable and non-usable, and then you get down into the muddled, contaminated stuff and everything,
Okay.
but it all is basically processed the same.
Can you tell the difference between a human and an animal?
Yes, you
Okay.
can.
And what about a plant or some?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Interesting.
For a second, I thought to myself, why would you need DNA from a plant? But then I suppose
Actually,
toxicology or
there
something?
have been some cases that have been solved by plant DNA.
Mm-hmm.
There have been cases where there has been a specific leaf in the back of someone's truck or something, and you trace it back to the tree. You can put them at the crime scene. You get a confession. There's cases like that.
Correct. Also, insects is another one. That's
Yep.
from like CSI that I.
Yeah.
So.
What's the study of insects called?
Entomology.
Entomology.
Good,
Yeah.
Good for you. Yes.
I did take a course in entomology.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And then you also did anthropology. What's that?
Yes, that is like more decaying.
Okay, decaying of
We're
stuff.
talking things that have been aged for a while.
Right.
Right. Okay.
So you can tell from like a pile of bones, gender and age,
Yeah.
Okay.
trauma.
Now, in order for an individual like yourself to be into this forensic science, you have to also understand anatomy,
Yes.
correct? Now, of course, the most basic one would be human anatomy.
Mhm.
And like I asked earlier, is there also like where you get into the different kinds of animal anatomy?
It's less called for.
Okay.
There's been very little demand, but you can learn about it. But it's more of like an independent study.
More for veterinarians, maybe?
Yeah.
Or? Okay.
Yeah. for those who, if you have a question for Stephanie at any point throughout the show, or anything regarding today's topic, you can either call in to the call-in line is open at 414-949-5778, or you can just ask it in the chat window. To do that, you just you make sure you're in the specific page for our live episode, and then I believe it's down in the comment section. You just comment something on the live episode, and then it'll appear in our chat window, and then we'll ask it away. Like Stephanie's a forensic scientist. She holds a Associates of Applied Science in forensic science.
Which brings me to this question.
Yes.
What made you become a forensic scientist?
Oh, the problem solving, like the puzzles.
Okay.
I wanted to figure out evidence. I wanted to solve the puzzles, connect the dots. And ultimately, I think it started with I wanted to figure out why people did bad things, like the psychology behind all of it, and it just kind of translated into the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So the evidence really shows their motives,
Yes.
and therefore the pattern of their psychological patterns is what you're saying. And that's pretty awesome. I guess, because we're leading into the next part of it, have you had the opportunity to review or to be a part of perhaps a caseload of serial killers?
I've studied it a little bit,
Okay.
but I guess it hasn't been a specific study, more curiosity.
Okay. So
Right.
it was more of a personal study?
Yeah.
Okay. And in your opinion, I mean, we live in the great state of Wisconsin, and surprisingly, to my surprise, because I came from a different area, Wisconsin has a history of serial killers.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on some of that?
Well, we have two big main ones that I think a lot of people know around here, Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein.
Yeah.
Pretty disturbed.
Very disturbing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we'll touch on that in just a few minutes. Just want to finish up some knowledge with forensic science and stuff like that. Now, what kind of tools do you use to collect evidence and uncover evidence, stuff like that, at a crime scene?
Well, there's a lot of different tools we actually have. It depends on the evidence. We have stuff for fingerprints, and then we have a lot of the stuff we just put in like paper bags, or we have little plastic vials and everything, and we take that back to the lab. But I don't know, a lot of the stuff at the crime scene is just collected and bagged.
Collected in a bag, okay. Now you use luminol to get blood?
Yeah.
To make blood?
But that would also be something you'd probably collect something from the crime scene, like a bed sheet or a shirt
Right.
or something, and you'd spray the luminol back at
The lab.
the lab.
Okay.
Unless you think it's a bigger area.
And that's to determine whether you're dealing with blood or another fluid?
Yep.
Okay. Like sperm, for instance, or anything like
Even
that?
though luminol is not the best thing we have out there for determining blood patterns, it has many false positives, including some citrus.
Seriously? Like
Ser-
orange?
Yep.
Interesting.
So we've actually transitioned to Blue Star, which does the job a little bit better.
And what is Blue Star? Is it a chemical
It
formula?
is a chemical.
Okay.
It's a little bit of a different color, but
Okay.
it is a better indicator.
Now,
More accurate,
I believe you also said that luminol more so kills the proteins in blood, which is what illuminates. Blue Star doesn't do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, folks, I'm learning a lot of stuff here myself. Kind of exciting.
And then another question that I had, and I had it like a minute ago, and then it escaped my mind.
Don't you love that?
I know, right? I just, I'm drawing a blank
You
because
can come back to it later.
yeah, we'll have to come back to that later because I just can't think of it for the life of me.
The audience, of course, doesn't remember this. We had some evidence from a case that we had, and you actually did a test on it, and it was so amazing to watch. First of all, do you remember some of it, especially the last test?
The test with the paint?
Yes, you know, and we were trying to figure out whether it was ectoplasm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I still believe. I mean, there's no way to test for ectoplasm.
There isn't, no.
But in the last test, you were doing it, and all of us were observing it. And do you remember the event that occurred during the test?
Not really, no.
Okay, well, let me elaborate real quick because you had a big part in this. As you added the material to test for the paint itself, there were like 3 different globulins that were occurring. One was mainly what it was supposed to be for paint, but there were 2 little drops that ended up separating from the main part. Do you remember that?
Now I do.
Okay.
Yes.
And what would you take as a forensic scientist? Because I believed it was an intelligent move by whatever was happening, okay? But I'm not a scientist. How would you interpret that last test?
It was definitely something different, something that would require further testing, more sophisticated instruments than I was using.
Yep.
But it was definitely interesting, and I'd be hesitant to conclude that it was paint. I would say it was something else, but I couldn't be positive. You know, it's more of just speculation. You kind of got to keep the opinions out of the science.
We didn't have like a microscope that we could look through. Basically, it was by the eyes, but I remember that all 3 tests came out negative.
Right.
And that was very unique for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I did remember the question that I was going to ask you. So so people say that no same fingerprint or no same DNA is the same. Is that true? Like, all patterns are different, completely different with fingerprints and...
No.
No?
There is of course, twin exception, and I believe that's the only one. But
and that's including their fingerprint?
Yep.
Wow. Exact copies.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Interesting. Now what about the lie detector test?
That's a complete myth. You can pass that very easily. It's just basically measuring, you know, heartbeat and blood pressure. You know, things that show you're nervous.
So
and you can be nervous just because you're being interrogated.
Like a test, like
right.
when you have like a test anxiety, it's the same thing. Yeah, and that's why they can't submit it in court anymore.
But there are still some places that require it, especially for sexual offenders. I think that's just not fair because there have been many serial killers that have passed it just because they're psychopaths.
Yeah, they don't have a conscience.
Right.
No, they don't care. They're not nervous. They can lie right through their teeth. They don't have. They don't care.
Right. Now, is there anything that actually is like specific to one person or something that actually does work 100% of the time that we know of?
No. Every forensic evidence is subject to human error, subject to bias. Nothing in this world, evidence-wise, can be perfect. And there's contamination.
Correct. When you say bias, could please elaborate on that? Because I know bias being maybe being against something because of a personal feeling, but
there is so much you can do to change something because of your bias. And you go into something thinking one way because we're humans. We automatically want the easiest solution. You think one way, and that's the evidence you're going to find. You could miss something completely that pointed the other way just because you're only looking for evidence supporting your conclusion.
Which appears to be happening a lot with police officers, especially. You know, I just got done watching Monk, and it seems like sometimes the captain is so stuck on one theory, and you got Monk over here going, "This is not what's going on here," you know.
And that's the reason I believe that police officers should, if they're doing evidence, they should just be doing evidence. Keep them out of everything else. We need more specialization to keep our evidence safe, keep our evidence sound, keep our evidence the way it should be.
Are police officers actually taught how to collect?
Yes.
You know, samples of whatever, you know, evidence.
Not in like school. But they will be taught as kind of on-the-job training. After you've been there for so long, you can be moved to the evidence.
So there's a protocol for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Now, are there any like big famous cases that you know of where where like at first the evidence proved them to be guilty, but then later on they were proven to be innocent?
Not specifically, but there are many, many cases. This is why the Innocence Project exists.
Mm-hmm.
The DNA was not introduced to a lot of the cases once upon a time ago, and when it's brought back, you can see it's just not. They
Right.
couldn't have been there. They couldn't have done this.
Okay.
Actually, Steve Avery was part of that project. The Innocence Project actually got him out of jail
The first time.
The first time, because it showed something about the DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And so
But
yeah,
that's
and
a
he's a
very
local guy.
controversial case too.
Yeah.
I think the evidence was right. I think the cops went about the wrong way. But that's just my personal opinion. There was too much bias in that situation with the Manitowoc Police Department.
Well, they said it was a personal issue.
It was.
Like the chief had an issue with him.
It definitely was.
Yeah. And I mean, we can
not knocking on the police.
Yeah. Oh, of course not. And we can certainly research that case and devote a whole episode to it if we want.
Sure, we could do
about,
that.
Stephen Avery's case and whatnot, because it is still there is still technically an ongoing case. With like obviously the making of a murder case brought that whole thing back up.
Yes, it did.
But
that whole show highlighted the police in the wrong light.
Yeah.
It's a lot worse than it was.
Right.
It wasn't good. Don't get me wrong.
I shouldn't say
but
anything.
Yeah.
The police didn't act right, don't get me wrong, but...
Well, the DA was... I met him a few times.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not impressed when I met him in person.
Okay.
Just his behavior and stuff. And I don't mean to make anyone angry, but, I watched the Netflix version of this, and I'm sorry, he was a schmuck. You know what I mean? But he had a job to do.
Mm.
They were really after Steve Avery at the time.
Yeah.
The body was found on his property.
Mm-hmm.
There was some incriminating evidence that was found there.
There definitely was, but they definitely put blinders on.
They sure did, yes.
Yeah. So when it comes to serial killers, there are four cases out of Wisconsin. However, and there are probably more that that are bigger cases. Yeah, four famous cases out of Wisconsin. However, we're only going to be attacking two of those tonight. Both of which are Jeffrey Dahmer and Ed Gein. Now we're going to touch on Jeffrey Dahmer first because Ed Gein is like his case is absolutely disgusting.
Well, they made movies based on him. So
oh yeah, and they have movies based on him. A lot of movies that are like popular horror movies. They're literally based on Ed Gein.
But I would honestly argue that Dahmer is worse.
Okay.
True. I mean,
yes.
Dahmer was more calculated, I think.
He killed more people.
Yeah.
17 total.
Far more people. It was more of a racial thing. It was more of a homophobic thing in his
But he was
tendencies.
homosexual.
Well, right.
Yeah, and I know a little bit about both of these. And I do have research files sitting in front of me, but I haven't actually read these research files yet, so I'm pretty much just going to be learning about it as we go.
Yes, you did. You lied.
I skim them. Okay,
skim them.
You said you did, sir.
However,
call them out, girl.
Stephanie and David have extensively read both of these, and I mean a lot of this Stephanie already knew.
Do we just want to open it to questions about the killer from you two, or how do we want to?
Well, let's talk about Jeffrey Dahmer, his origin.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's. I mean, do you want to talk about it? His origin. Jeffrey Dahmer's
Whoever
origin?
wants to. Maybe.
It's up to you. I mean, he can talk about it. You can talk about it.
Someone start, please.
Okay.
Ladies first.
Oh, okay. Dahmer, he had a pretty normal start of his childhood. He didn't really seem even abnormal until his parents divorced.
Actually,
he had the surgery.
And it was actually a pretty bad surgery.
What surgery?
A hernia. a double hernia, which is very unusual,
And he
especially for a
was young,
4-year-old.
yeah.
He was 4 years old, and they said after that he became like almost depressing, and he was withdrawn. I remember that from reading it.
Yeah.
So after you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. But then he never actually showed any other like warning signs until his parents divorced.
True.
Okay.
I believe that was about 14.
Correct. And that's, I think it was around that was the time he became sexually
Yeah.
obsessed.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes.
where was Jeffrey Dahmer from?
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, like what city specifically?
Don't remember.
You don't remember?
Nope.
Well, Plainfield.
No, that was Ed.
Milwaukee.
Milwaukee.
That's right.
Milwaukee is Jeffrey Dahmer, exactly.
That's
If you knew the answer.
He was, May 2nd, actually.
I was just giving you the credit. So
That's right. I'm getting two serial killers mixed up.
Oh
Now-
no, let's not do that.
Yeah.
now, do you want me to talk a bit about him?
Yeah,
Or?
go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's your
Mike.
show.
So, well,
Yeah.
it's your show too.
True.
So he was both a convicted serial killer and a sex offender, Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yep. In fact, for a while, those sex offending actually covered up his serial killing because they only focused on one, not realizing he was doing the other.
Yeah, and he killed roughly 17 males between 1978 and 1999.
Most of them in the later 2 years.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he totally accelerated in the late, and something
Very
triggered
rapid.
that, which is usually a sign of triggering.
Exactly. So he was born. He was born in West Allis, May 21st, 1960. That's when he was born. And over the course of 13 years, he's mostly sought out men.
African American.
They're mostly African American.
Yep.
And he found them at gay bars, malls, and bus stops.
Bus stops, yeah.
And then he would lure them to their home with promises of money or sex. And then he gave them alcohol. He gave them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them to death. And then he would engage in sex acts with the corpses before dismembering them and then disposing of them, often keeping their skulls or genitals as souvenirs. And then he took photos of his victims at various stages of the murder process,
Yep.
so that he could recollect each act afterward and relive the experience. He was eventually captured in 1991. He was sentenced to 16 life terms.
He was never going to see the light of day.
Exactly. And then he was killed by fellow prison inmate Christopher Scarver on November 28th, 1994.
Yeah, him and one other guy by the same.
Yeah.
That guy in the
Were
same
killed,
day.
yeah.
In the same day.
Well, actually, they were in a work detail,
Mhm.
and Scarver, something happened. I mean, he was freaked out about Jeffrey Dahmer anyway.
Uh-huh.
Because
Oh, yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer would actually turn his food into like images of body parts.
Yeah, it
and-
was
And
bones of some sort. I believe.
yep, and this guy was left alone with Jeffrey Dahmer and another inmate, Andrews, I think his name was.
Yep. I
And
think so.
the cops or the guards left,
Mhm.
and they usually don't do that.
Right.
And this gentleman who kind of saved taxpayers how much money, just bludgeoned them with some kind of weight.
Yeah.
Yeah,
weight
from,
bar.
from the weight room. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the fact that he was targeting men that were African American, because he was promising them money or sex,
Mm-hmm.
and then he would engage with sex acts in them, and then kill
Yeah.
them.
Post
Was this
death.
man homosexual or
Which one?
bisexual? Jeffrey Dahmer.
Well,
Probably.
I guess there was some homophobia there, but yes, he was most. I mean, his actions
I'm
were.
pretty sure he was afraid of his sexuality. That's where that homophobia came from.
Okay.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, one of his arrests were because he was a bunch of young kids,
Mhm.
and he masturbated in front of them.
Mhm.
Okay, so he was very deranged when it came to sexuality.
Mhm.
All right, and it doesn't really specify whether his parents were beating him or neglecting him or anything like that. So who knows where that came from?
Like I said, I think his childhood seemed fine until the divorce.
Yeah.
Well, the surgery, but I don't.
Yeah.
It just got worse years down the road.
Now, for those wondering about the arrest and how that happened, when Dahmer got arrested. So, he was arrested on July 22nd, 1991. And on that day, 2 Milwaukee police officers picked up Tracy Edwards, who was a 32-year-old African-American man. He was wandering the streets with a handcuff dangling from his wrist. They decided to investigate the man's claims that, as he described, a weird dude had drugged and restrained him. So they arrived at Dahmer's apartment, and
This gets me.
ironically, Dahmer just calmly offered to get the keys for the handcuffs. They're just like,
Wow.
give us the handcuffs,
There was
please.
no emotions whatsoever.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Edwards, he claimed that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with, it was in the bedroom. So when the officer went in to corroborate the story, he noticed Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies lying around, and Dahmer was then subdued by the officers, and subsequent searches revealed a head in the refrigerator, 3 more in the freezer, and a catalog of other disgusting crap, horrors, including preserved skulls, jars containing genitalia, and an extensive gallery of macabre Polaroid photographs of his victims. And then his refrigerator and Polaroid photographs became inextricably associated with his notorious killing spree. In 1996, following his death, a group of Milwaukee businessmen raised more than $400,000 to purchase the items used for his victims. They included blades, saws, handcuffs, and a refrigerator. His refrigerator stores body parts. They promptly destroyed them in an effort to distance the city from the horrors of Dahmer's actions and the ensuing media circus that surrounded his trial.
Now, who destroyed them? Is what I'm trying to figure out.
The
Businessmen.
businessmen.
They got rid of it. Okay.
Yeah. Now, interesting enough, the hotel that he actually rented a hotel room to basically kill all his victims. Like,
No.
Not all of them. He lived with his grandma for a
Yeah, it
while.
was his grandma's house.
some of his victims he murdered at a hotel.
Yeah, exactly. It was the accelerated stage.
Yeah.
Where he was killing almost every other day or something like
Yeah.
that.
That hotel still stands and is still in full operation.
Sure.
It's called the Union Hotel, and it's right across the street, like a block down from the Rave Eagles Club in Milwaukee.
Yep.
I don't know. I've never been. I've seen it in person. I've never been inside. I have no idea if they decided to gut out the original room and just use it as maybe like a storage closet, or if they actually decided to just clean it up and like continue to rent it out to people. I have no idea.
We should call them and ask them if they need paranormal investigators, just to see. I mean, those kind of crimes.
Yeah.
Leave a stain. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and he did, have an apartment complex, and we saw that on Street View.
Yeah.
We saw his apartment complex on Street View. But and then he also had a house that I don't know if he actually did live at, that at a house in Milwaukee at one time. And I have actually seen pictures of that house. However, I've not been able to find it on Google recently.
Well, here's the thing: is his father? I think his father and mother, but Lionel.
Yeah.
Lionel. Yep.
He became kind of out of hand. He had a drinking problem for a long time. His father actually wanted him to go in the army, so he enlisted. He ended up in Germany for I don't know how many years.
Yeah.
And I guess he wasn't a bad soldier, but he had a drinking problem. So
he was
Right.
kicked out.
And there was some issues in Germany. They ended up investigating Dahmer to see if because it was 14 cases.
Yeah.
Of women actually
Exactly.
that were disappearing. Yeah.
So I'm just going to briefly describe his childhood, and then we'll talk a little bit more on Jeffrey Dahmer, and then we'll finish up with Ed Gein. So his parents were Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, and he was described as an energetic and a happy child until the age of 4. With the surgery that you mentioned, he had to have surgery to correct a double hernia, and that seemed to affect a change in him. Noticeably, he was subdued, and he became increasingly withdrawn from the birth of his younger brother and the family's frequent moves. So by his early teen years, he was disengaged, tense, and largely friendless. He claims that his compulsions toward necrophilia and murder began around the age of 14, but it did appear that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their acrimonious divorce a few years later was probably the catalyst for turning these thoughts into actions.
Now, before you continue, at the age of 4, he's actually put under anesthesia.
Yeah.
Okay. And because you cannot be awake for hernia operation,
Right.
It's too painful. So they made the correction. I'm wondering, his changes could it have been from the anesthesia?
I think it's possible.
Because this is a chemical reactor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I know I've been under anesthesia before, and I'm nuts. I'm kidding. I'm blaming the anesthesia.
Yeah, but anyway, his first murder, it occurred just after graduating from high school in June 1978. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and took him to his parents' house. Then he proceeded to get drunk with the man. And then when Hicks tried to leave, then Dahmer killed him by striking him on the head, and then he strangled him with a barbell. Mm-hmm. And then he obviously he dismembered the corpse of his first victim. And then he packed the body parts in a plastic bag, and he buried them behind his parents' home. And then he later actually exhumed the remains. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them across the wood ravine.
So that's saying that most likely there were only bones left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it must have been like a year or two later.
And then with his, what you mentioned his army part. Mm-hmm. When by the time of his first killing, his alcohol consumption had spun out of control, so he dropped out of Ohio State University after just 1 quarter term, and then his recently remarried father insisted that he join the army, so he enlisted in late December 1978, and then he was posted to Germany shortly thereafter. But his drinking problem did persist, and
it's kind of creepy.
I know.
I was in that area at the time.
So the army discharged him in 1981.
I'd like to know where he was actually stationed.
So yeah, that's basically his life.
You know, it's funny. You and I talked about this earlier because I had a thought about my own relative. My mom did say that there was a lot of women disappearing in the Frankfurt area.
Right.
Okay.
I just think it goes completely against his MO to switch to women.
Well, and that's what happened. Well, yeah.
I think, I don't know, it feels like he started with the African American men. If he switched to women and then go right back, it feels a little weird.
Is that normal for
No.
No?
MO is the one thing that normally stays the same regardless. And he didn't snap yet because his escalation hadn't happened. If it went up to his escalation and then his escalation was women, that would make more sense.
Correct.
Instead of break,
Yeah. I mean, as I said, it was females that were disappearing in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Back in the late 70s, all the way into 82.
Yeah. I made an executive decision that we're going to do Ed Gein next week.
Well, yeah, we don't have much time.
You spent too much time reading the sheet.
Yeah. Well, and there is a little bit more that I kind of do want to touch base on. I actually noticed that there's a bit more that I want to cover on Jeffrey Dahmer.
Gotcha.
And I mean Ed Gein. Ed
Gein can't just be brushed over.
No, Ed Gein is not going to be rushed over. We will do him next week.
Okay.
But there is, still I want to talk about here. So, when his like I said, his drinking problem, and then he was discharged from the army. German authorities, they did later investigate possible connections between Dahmer and murders that took place
and those women like you're talking about
in the area during that time. Yeah.
I would freak if he was in Frankfurt, because that was like my dad worked there. He was in the army there. Maybe him and Dahmer had a few drinks together.
Yeah, I don't know. But they do believe that he did not claim any victims at all while he was actually in the armed forces.
Okay. But that's weird.
I believe if he did, he would have, he crushed up that one guy. I think he would have covered his tracks a little better, and I think they would have been male.
Yeah, exactly.
I think he
had never, even in his later investigations, he never admitted to doing anything in Germany.
And
right.
I think he would have. I definitely think he would have. I think he wanted the recognition.
Yeah. True.
Yeah.
True.
So, so then after his discharge, he returned home to Ohio. And then he was actually was arrested later that year for disorderly contact.
He was living with his grandmother at the
yeah,
time, right?
Yeah.
It prompted his father to send Dahmer to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So it was his grandmother that lived here, but it was his parents that lived in Ohio.
Okay.
So he was sent to Wisconsin then. And his alcohol problem did continue, and then he was arrested in the following summer for indecent exposure.
Yeah, in front of little kids.
Yeah, and then he was arrested once again in 1986 when he was accused by two boys of masturbating in front of them, which
Yep.
you said.
We were talking about.
Yep. And he received 1 year probationary sentence for that.
Had they only known the truth.
I know, right? That this man would go on to kill, how many people?
Well, yeah. And it's cannibalism. That's
Exactly.
the weird part.
And then in September of 1987, he killed a second victim whose name was Stephen Tuomi or something like that.
Okay.
I think that's how you pronounce that. So they had checked into a hotel room and drank. This would be the Union Hotel. And then Dahmer eventually awoke to find Tuomi dead with no memory of the previous night's activity. So I'm guessing that he likely killed him when he was drunk.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
And then he bought a large suitcase to transport the guy's body to his grandmother's basement. And there he dismembered it there, and he masturbated on the corpse before disposing of the remains.
Pretty gross, isn't it?
Oh my god. I was grossed out just reading that.
That was my reaction while I was reading it in the vehicle.
Oh my god, this guy had issues.
You think?
Not as much as the next one.
I know.
He had real mommy issues.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then after Dahmer had killed another 2 victims at his grandmother's home, then she got tired of her grandson's late nights and drunkenness. So she had no knowledge of what he was doing in his personal time with any. She had no knowledge of any of the killings.
What they had on the internet.
Yeah. So then she forced him to move out in 1988. And then in September of 1989, Dahmer had an extremely. He had a very, very lucky opportunity. He had an encounter with a 13-year-old Laotian boy, wherever that.
Laos, by Taiwan. By Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia.
He had an encounter with him, which resulted in charges of sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault for Dahmer.
Which,
not so lucky for him.
but I'm pretty sure he argued his way out of this one.
Actually,
he argued his way out of one of the sexual assault ones. Very.
Well,
you're right. He manipulated it.
He did feel guilty because he claimed that the boy had appeared much older.
This is all his defense.
Yeah.
He isn't capable of feeling guilt.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't capable of feeling guilt at all.
The man is just a master manipulator.
Exactly. Yeah, and then so then he was basically awaiting his sentence for his sexual assault case, and again, then he started to use his grandmother's basement again for this stuff.
Because he played that case so well, he got out in 10 months, I think.
Yep, right, exactly.
And
and the thing that gets me about that particular incident is that he said that the sentencing made him a different person.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
he even got the sentence where he could go out during the day,
and
he
work,
just had to come back.
Yeah.
Work release.
Exactly.
And again, you're dealing with a real monster here.
Yeah. And then his
But
next...
he was just so good at convincing people he wasn't a monster. He was just troubled.
You know.
He was just...
He was the victim.
Yeah. And then his next victim, Anthony Sears, he lured, drugged, strangled, sodomized, photographed, and dismembered and disposed of this guy in March of 1989. This guy was actually an aspiring model.
Yep.
So, at his initial trial for his child molestation, which took place in May 1989, he was the subject of contrition. I think that's how you say that. Like,
contrition.
Yeah, like the model of contrition. Arguing eloquently, in his own defense, that how he had seen the errors of his ways, and that his arrest marked a turning point in his life, like you said. He was trying to use sympathy to get off, even though he couldn't feel it.
He was manipulating the entire court system.
Yeah,
and got away with it.
He was good at it.
Exactly.
Well, and that's just it. Most serial killers, they always say, "Well, he was such a nice guy."
So
you know?
No, he was just so good at faking it.
Yeah.
So then his attorney basically just argued that he needed treatment.
Which he never actually did get.
Right. Not to be put in jail, not incarceration.
Is there a special
or anything.
course for serial killers?
I know. So then, incredibly, the judge actually agreed with saying that he needed treatment and not to be put in prison. So he basically got out of a 1-year prison sentence. Yep.
We're gonna have to run over. Let's talk about the ending of this man.
Yeah.
What?
Just
hurry up, let's end him.
Let's talk about his ending.
Okay.
Well, not his actual death, but because we already talked about that a little bit.
And then, well, do you want to do part 2 or no to finish this or no?
I think we can finish it pretty short.
Okay. So we have just a little bit left in this episode, and we pretty much discussed him fully, because Dahmer did have a job during the day, so basically he worked out, would return to prison at night. That's what we were
talking
the work
about.
release program.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
A lot of the stuff you're reading from the sheet we skipped ahead to in our general discussion.
My bad.
Well, let's talk. We got like a minute.
Did you talk about the fact that he had a 5-year probationary sentence?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, but that's really neither here nor there. Mm-hmm. The subject about serial killers is that one thing that they have in common, most of the time, they have an abusive father and a smothering mother. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, 2 people come to mind about that stereotype. They're also known as Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Same identical background in the sense that they had a very abusive father, and they're the greatest serial killers you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, they killed millions of people. That's a common denominator that I discovered.
I agree. In my research, it's always something in the childhood,
a certain
something
pattern,
traumatic. Yeah.
Now, it doesn't seem like Jeffrey Dahmer had the worst life. But I think something happened in his brain, his chemistry or something. Not excusing his actions, but they can't be normal.
I think maybe in the case of him, he started off a little abnormal, and the divorce pushed him over the edge.
Yeah.
I think the trauma
he went from being abnormal to psychologically imbalanced.
Right.
Okay.
I think that the trauma of the divorce, which a normal person would take differently, him being a little off the edge in the first place, took a little...
Because that's when he actually started drinking.
Right.
Around the age of 14.
Yeah. Alright, guys, well, that is it for this week. We talked about forensic science. We talked about Jeffrey Dahmer, all about him. Don't forget to like us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/The Social Factor Podcast. And we will see you all next week with a... we will see you next week at Saturday with an all-new episode.
Good night, everyone.
Take care.